Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. Last video we talked about the goal of machine learning, which is the generalizability. Now in this video we will get into some terms about machine learning, especially about the dataset. Now a dataset is a collection of information that is composed of separate elements but can be manipulated as a unit by a computer. For example, it could be represented as a matrix or arrays in computer. And the features are the attributes of the dataset. An instance, observation, or data point are discrete units of information. For example, one ID or one number of, for example, person information in a dataset can be one data point. And label is the answer portion of an observation or data point, and it's especially in supervised learning, which we will talk about later. Now, for labels, you only need to know that it is the feature you want to predict in this dataset. Now, here is an example of a representation of dataset. We could think of it from U of T. Now, you could pause here and take a minute to find out what are the features and what are the data points in this dataset.
A few moments later.
Okay, now here's the answer. The features are each column here. For example, the name, or gender, or grade, or faculty, because these are the attributes of a person. And the ID here is also a feature, even if it has several numbers on it. And what about the data points? Well, each data point is one row. For example, for this person, we know she's Anna. She has an ID of 1, a name of Anna, gender of female, a grade of 95, a faculty of arts. So this one row together would be one data point. And there are 3 data points in this data set. Now I want to talk about label. As I said, label is a feature you want to predict in this data set. It could be any of the features in this data set. For example, if I want to predict the grade of a person in our machine learning model, then this grade, which is a feature, could be our label. So we will separate out this label portion, which is the answer we want to find, and use the other parts in the dataset to find the answer we want. And there could be any feature or any features to be the label. It depends on which feature is the answer you want to know. For example, we could predict the grade of a person or a data point, or we could predict the gender of a data point. Well, that is an inappropriate example, but just so you know, from a data set, any columns can become our features or labels we want to do with it. And within the data set, there are many components we could have when we are doing training. For example, we could have a part called training set, which is a set of observations used to generate machine learning models. So we basically use the training set to train a machine learning model. There could be a validation set, a set of observations used during model training to provide feedback on how well the current parameters generalize beyond the training set. Now you'll see the generalize here, which is what we are talking about from last video. The validation set is used to help us judge how the model performed and how well the model trained using training set could generalize. It is a measure of generalizability. Finally, we could have a test set, which is a set of observations used at the end of the model training and validation to assess the predictive power of the model, which is another indicative feature how generalizable is a model to unseen data. Now this test set result, which is also called testing loss of testing error, is used mainly on your report when you're reporting to others how well your model could perform. And at the end, there's a terminology called Dataset Split, which is a process to separate the dataset to above 3 in a ratio. So for example, the table we see in the last slide could be a complete dataset, and we can split the dataset into the 3 parts training set, validation set, and test set to help us do the training and get a final result. So, for example, in this meme that we just see in the last video, we have in-class exercises, homework exercises, and on exam. But these three could actually be the training set, validation set, and test set in our machine learning process. In class, when you're doing the exercise, the teacher is kind of training you to get you the ability to solve problems. And in homework, you are sort of evaluating yourself. Are your way of learning effective and correct? And if not, you should go back and redo your training. And finally, on the test. Well, the test or exam of a semester is the last thing we will do. And usually, we don't care anymore after the exam, which means that the exam or test, its purpose is purely to evaluate our performance. And after that, this course is done. We no longer get the chance to do further training or learning, and it's meaningless to study after the exam, well, for common sense, right? So this is actually the purpose of test set. Here I want to explain how dataset split works. We could have a look at the bottom here, which is the most common way of dataset split that I introduced before. We could have a training set, a validation set, and a testing set. Now we could say that the majority of this dataset are split into the training set. This makes sense because we want our model to learn as much data as possible. So the majority of data should go to our model training. And we could use a small portion to do validation in order to measure the current model performance. And if the performance is not ideal, we'll go back to use training set to train. And finally, after the training and validation are done, we move to the final testing in order to test a final performance measure of our model. And we could have a reporting accuracy. Now, the important part is for training and validation. There's a principle that no data in validation set should go to your model training. It's strictly prohibited because if your model has seen the validation data, then it could definitely perform well on the validation data. This is the same with testing set. For the analogy, for example, if you have seen the exam question before the exam, well, of course you can answer that question. But do you really understand that portion of knowledge? I don't think so. So for the model training, it's the same thing. You shouldn't let any of the data in validation set and testing set to be one part of the training set, or to let the model train using any of the data from validation set or testing set. Now, after this common type of dataset split, we can see another type, which is called cross-validation. Here, the testing portion is still left out because finally we still have to do a test on the unseen data. But in the original method, right, your validation data is unique and your training data is unique. So there's only a small portion used for validation. But in cross-validation, we have a method called k-fold, which means that we could fold this training set k times. So we have k equal portion. For example, we could have a fourfold, which means that we'll split this training set into 4 equal portions. For example, imagine that we have 4 equal portions here. We label them 1, 2, 3, 4. And we could use the first, second, and third to do the training, and the fourth one to do the validation. And we could use the first fold to do validation, and the second, third, fourth to do training. Well, in this way, we can have 4 combinations of training and validation. This gives us much more result about how the model is performing and how the training is going on. So it is actually a much powerful way to test our model performance. But the principle in validation and training still holds, because any of your data for validation should not be used to train the model, even in cross-validation, which means that the training in each fold should be all dependent. The model can only use the first, second, third part to do training and the fourth part to do validation. And if you're doing a cross-validation, then the model should never trained using the first method again. So all of these 4 combinations of training and validation should be independent. Okay, so that is about the second video, and thank you for listening. In the next video, I will be talking more about the actual types of learning.